Well, thanks very much, Dame Diana, and thanks to the APPG for the invitation to participate in the launch of this really important paper. I'm humbled to be part of this event and to follow Diana and Mia's incredible words, really powerful. But let me say congratulations to the APPG for this important report and also for raising this incredibly important topic. In my view, working with the 57 OSCE countries, the most significant piece of the global anti-trafficking strategy that is missing is attention to demand. It's just that simple. As an international community, we're putting substantial resources into prosecution, into protection of victims, and yet we're currently losing the battle in pretty significant ways. Estimates about the amount of money generated from this industry have tripled in recent years. The number of child victims of trafficking tripled in the last 15 years. These are just some of the data points showing that we're not getting a grip on the problem. And even though the number of identified victims continues to go up, prosecutions are actually declining. And so in the words of a survivor, Rachel Moran from Ireland, how do you expect to uproot a tree if all you're doing is ripping at the leaves? The fact of the matter is that it's time to address the core problem here, which is demand. So why do we need to address demand? I think the paper sets out the reasons really well, and I just want to emphasize a few of them. The first one, in my view, is because the current model is not working. The approach of not addressing demand is failing, and it's time to turn the tables and start addressing the core cause. The reason for that is that we need to undermine the financial motivations behind trafficking. Traffickers don't do what they want because it's fun, they do what they want because they like to make a lot of money. And if we can undermine those financial motivations by curbing demand, we can try to get a grip on the problem. The second or more important reason, though, is about reducing harm. The incentive to traffic, to forcibly coerce people into exploitation, comes from the desire to make money, from demand. And if we can discourage that, we can reduce that harm to traffic victims. But we also don't want to forget about the harm that users cause directly to victims as a result of being in direct and intimate contact with victims, as Diana and Mia just described. This is a harm that is often glossed over, and the harm of trafficking is always identified as that caused by the trafficker, but not by the user. When in fact, those rapes that were so just heartbreakingly discussed earlier, that's the harm that causes that trauma that lasts a lifetime. As Mia said, you can't separate that trauma based on somebody who was in prostitution versus somebody who was being trafficked. I think also the point about gender and racial equality cannot be overstated. Trafficking for sexual exploitation vastly disproportionately impacts women and girls, in particular women and girls who are minorities. How do we expect to achieve gender equality with all the work that's going on that topic right now, and yet maintain unfettered demand? It's not possible. They are in direct conflict with each other. And so to do one, we have to do the other. It's time to address that issue of male sexual violence against women. And in this regard, I just want to note, I looked at the participant list. There's a tremendous amount of women on this, not very many men. Men who are not buyers need to start stepping up a little bit and bringing their voices to this issue, because it can't only be women raising this topic. Men need to say that this is completely unacceptable from our perspective as well. So it's important to address demand. Now, how are countries doing? Not good. We are currently conducting a study on countries complying with their international legal obligations, and over 20 of the OSCE 57 countries are doing no identifiable law or prevention effort at all on demand. And we question why trafficking is out of control. For those that are doing something, implementation is certainly lacking. Let me give you a good example. The UK actually has a pretty decent law, 53A of the Sexual Offences Act, that allows you to prosecute somebody who uses trafficking victim. In 10 years, 2010 to 2019, there were 66 convictions. In 2019 alone, there was over 1,600 identified trafficking victims. 66 convictions in a decade. That is totally inadequate to get a grip on the problem. And that's one of the reasons that a much more robust response is needed. When some countries pass a law on demand and everybody says, see, it didn't solve the problem. Well, of course it didn't solve the problem if you only convicted 66 people in a decade. That's not implementation. So what are my recommendations for the way forward? I think first and foremost, the paper outlines what needs to be done, which is a more robust criminal justice response. And this includes both recognizing those who are using trafficking victims, but also recognizing the broader problem of demand, because you can't really distinguish those two. And international law recognizes this. The Palermo Protocol doesn't talk about demand for trafficking. There is no such thing as your paper recognizes. It's the demand that fosters exploitation that leads to trafficking. This is a much more broad concept, and that's the concept that should be used in policymaking. That all buying needs to be addressed if you're going to try to address the buying that is incentivizing trafficking. One of the values of a criminal law, and there are those who oppose the criminalization, but let me talk about why I think it's important. It holds demand accountable for the harm that it's causing by incentivizing trafficking, but also the direct harm to victims. Recognizing that harm and holding those responsible accountable for that harm is a crucial piece of this response. It also incentivizes law enforcement to pay attention to the problem. In countries where there are no criminalization aspects of demand, law enforcement is not incentivized to work on this issue. But if there are criminal sanctions available, then law enforcement will pay attention and more closely scrutinize. And the last reason is it sets a norm. We need a norm against this conduct because it's incentivizing trafficking and driving it. There needs to be some statement against it. If you don't have a law saying that, it sort of implies that it's okay. And that's the current situation, I think, in the United Kingdom. The last 2 points I want to make, though, because I know we're low on time, are these. A criminal law is not going to solve this problem on its own. It's a fundamental piece of the response, but there has to be a broader attempt at developing a prevention framework. Criminalization and criminal prosecution should really be the last point in the interaction in trying to address this problem. We need to start talking way upstream about educating young men and boys and adolescents about healthy relationships, mutuality, respect, consent, gender equality, all of these concepts. We need to start talking about addressing this issue of demand from a public health lens, which is certainly something where government can be involved. In terms of understanding how it fosters harm to people who are vulnerable and how it is not conducive to gender equality. We need to be using all sorts of technology-based interventions to try to deter and discourage demand before we even get to the point where transactions and harmful rapes are happening. Again, criminalization is certainly an important piece of the pie, but I want to really encourage a more comprehensive perspective on this that can do more at preventing in the long term. And the final piece is websites that have been mentioned several times. These websites are out of control. The Scottish Parliament paper on this was very insightful in understanding that, and they need to be addressed. These are platforms for exploitation that encourage and facilitate and foster demand. And if those are not addressed, the demand intervention techniques that are being discussed here today will have a very hard time being successful. So those three aspects of criminalization, prevention, and addressing demand, I think, addressing websites are the three pieces of the puzzle that should be considered as the way forward. Finally, victims need support, not sanction. I love that phrase from the paper, and I think it could not be more clear. It's not going to help the process if we keep punishing them. They need enough support and help to recover anyway, and criminalization is not going to help them at all. We're going to be releasing a paper on our findings, and I hope that paper is useful to Parliament moving forward on this. And on June 14th to the 16th, our annual Alliance Conference for all the 57 countries of the OSCE. We'll be talking about this issue of demand, and we hope you can all attend and help us raise attention to this important issue. Thank you so much, Dame Diana, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate it, and thanks to all my fellow panelists who gave such powerful words today. Thanks a lot.